Okay. So for those who are asking questions, yes, this is a webinar format. So you're all on mute, you're all silenced unless we unmute you. So please feel free to use the Q&A function or the chat function to interact. But those of you who are wondering whether they can be seen in their pajamas or heard yelling at their children, no, we can't either see or hear any of that. So welcome to SVA's first in a series of webinars towards an inclusive recovery. My name's Lisa Fowkes and I'm the Director of Employment for Social Ventures Australia. And I want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we are meeting, or the lands on which many of us live and work. In my case, that is the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, which is also where SVA's headquarters in Sydney is based. I want to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and any Indigenous people here today. And it's timely to remember in this pandemic the significance of pandemics in Australian history and their legacy of exclusion and inequality that we live with today, and I guess which is one of the things that we need to be aware of as we emerge from this pandemic. So I want to start, for those of you who don't know SVA well, by just telling you a little bit about our organisation. So Social Ventures Australia is a not-for-profit organisation. We work with partners to address disadvantage or to attempt to alleviate disadvantage, and we aim for an Australia in which people and communities thrive. That's a broad ambition. We do it in a number of ways. We do it through, in our consulting team, with working with organisation, not-for-profit and government to try to solve social problems or help organisations improve their performance, understand and improve their performance. In our impact investing team, in looking at innovative ways of bringing capital to social purpose sector. And in the ventures team, which is where I sit, we look for projects, conversations to catalyse ideas that have the capacity to nudge towards system change or contribute to system change. And this conversation about the idea of an inclusive recovery is one such conversation. It's a conversation we hope will bring together people from different backgrounds with different experiences to try to think about how we emerge from the COVID-19 economic crisis with a more inclusive society. I want to acknowledge too in that the importance of the philanthropic support that we get as an organisation, and certainly in my team, our work and our interest in the idea of employment, particularly for young people and quality employment, has been supported by the Macquarie Group Foundation, as well as other generous philanthropic funders. And without that work, without that support, we can't attempt to do the things that we do to try to bring different parties together. So to talk a little bit about why we're holding this webinar and what the central idea is, I guess what we were thinking about 3 months ago was how we can contribute to creating to nudging systems to create better pathways for young people in particular into good quality work. There's a lot of talk about headline unemployment, but within that headline figure, there are a whole lot of disconnects in the labour market. There's a growing problem of underemployment. The gap in underemployment rates for between young people and older people is widening. There are a whole lot of people in jobs that don't use their skills. There are a whole lot of people missing out on skills that they could use. So that was the idea that we have been working on for some months and have been focused on. And then, of course, this economic crisis, this health crisis initially, and economic crisis hit. And what we know about these times of economic crisis is that they have the capacity to accelerate critical social changes. and to exacerbate issues that were there before. So already we know that as unemployment has risen and as we move forward, the unemployment queue will get longer. So those people who are already at the end of the queue before the crisis have suddenly got a lot more people in front of them. But beneath the headline unemployment rate, there are also distributional consequences. So some of the changes, so the shedding of jobs due to automation, for example, the changes in supply chain, the move to precarious work, all of these things have the potential to get worse through this crisis as employers try to restore their balance sheets, to have shed labour and then think about who they're bringing back on. So one of the critical questions that we think we need to talk about and talk about quickly is, what do we need to do now to make sure that when we come out of this economic crisis, that instead of entrenching inequalities and exacerbating existing negative trends for people facing disadvantage, that we have a more inclusive labour market, that the opportunities that are created, that emerge, that stay, are distributed in a way that promotes equality and opportunity, that promotes social mobility for those who start behind the 8 ball, and that certainly does not cause further harm to those who are disadvantaged in the labour market. And as a stark reminder of that, for those of you who saw the news coverage of the Brain and Mind Institute's modelling around suicide rates, you know, what they drew a direct connection between increase in unemployment for young people and potential for increased suicide rates. So there are profound issues, not just for people's ability to work and their income, but for the broader society, our social fabric. So that is the set of challenges that face us today. We are at a really critical moment. We want to have this conversation about what does an inclusive recovery look like. So to kick off this conversation, I'm really delighted that Professor Jeff Borland has agreed to start to frame up for us what the labour market is looking like and how that might play out in the future. Jeff is a Professor of Economics at Melbourne University, but he's also an engaged academic. He sits on the board of CEDA, he engages with not-for-profits like ours, he advises governments and others about policy. So he's very engaged and he produces regular reports. He's one of the first people off the mark to sort of say, this is what we're seeing, and to help us understand the problem as it emerges. And Jeff also in 2018 was part of the expert panel that advised the government on the design of new employment services. So that's one of the areas that we may want to discuss today as we go forward. So the way it's going to work is Jeff's going to present some of his findings, his analysis of the situation and some ideas going forward. And then we will have a time for Q&A. Now you'll see a Q&A button down the bottom of your screen. Please put your questions in there. We're going to see if we can find you and bring up your screen so that you're more than an abstract question, but we may not be able to do that. We've got lots of people participating. We may not be able to locate you, but don't be shocked if we reach out to you and say, hey, you know, here's your 30 seconds of fame and we'd like you to ask the question. But otherwise, I'll read them out, and you can also vote up questions. So there's a little thumbs up, I think, thing on your on the Q&A where you can vote up questions. So I should be quiet now and let Jeff get on with telling us about this problem and helping us frame the problem.
Oh, thanks very much, Lisa and Simon and SVA, for the invitation to talk. So I thought in the time that I've got today, try and do 4 things. Just make sort of a basic point about the impact COVID-19 is having on economic activity, which I think people are pretty familiar with by now, but just such an important point that I wanted to sort of begin with it. Then talk about what we know so far about who's being affected, say something about recovery, and then you give sort of an overview of some policy areas that I think are going to be important during the recovery and afterwards. So the introductory point I want to make is that this recession downturn is quite different to previous ones in the sense that it's got two main drivers. There are two reasons that we're seeing decrease in output and employment. And those same two factors are going to be really important in determining the speed and extent of recovery. The thing that's obviously new, which so far has been the big driver of the decrease in output employment, is the health-related factors. So government mandated business closures and businesses closing and consumer spending decreasing because of fear of contracting COVID-19. So much of the downturn that we've seen so far has been directly related to those health-related factors. As time goes on, though, we'll start to see a more regular type of economic downturn and recession. So what I've called here indirect factors. So we're already starting to see this a bit, I think, but increasingly we'll see decrease in consumer spending, especially discretionary spending, because people will have experienced decreases in income or wealth, or they'll be uncertain about the future, and we'll start to see decrease in business investment because of their lowered expectations of profitability. And I think it's important to sort of have both those factors in mind to understand things like why it is that this episode, why the decrease in output and employment came on so quickly. Obviously, it's because in this episode we've had this direct health-related effect, but it's also important to keep in mind that that even if we were able to open up the economy in an instant, we'd still have that second factor, which will sort of have some influence for a period of time afterwards. And of course, the longer the health-related closures go on, the more people lose income, the less business becomes confident about investment, and the bigger that indirect effect becomes. So that's just really important background to keep in mind, I think, in understanding what's happening. What do we know so far about who's being affected? Well, we still have relatively limited data. I guess on May 14th, the ABS will release their labour force survey, which will be the most comprehensive, detailed perspective on what's happened in April. But the ABS has been very sort of forward-thinking and active in developing other data sets to give us more real-time perspectives on what's happening, and they've partnered with the ATO, the Australian Tax Office, to use payroll data so that they can say something more quickly about what's happening to jobs. So the data that they released this week tells us between March 14th and April 18th, March 14th was when we got to the 100th case in Australia, there's been 7.5% of total jobs lost, and a decrease in 8.2% in wages paid to employees. So this is basically looking at data that companies put into the ATO through the One Touch system. The ATO is able to count up how many jobs there are at each point in time, compare across time, compare the wage payments across time, and come to this measure. And so what it's saying is that in a very short period of time, 5 weeks, there's been 7.5% of total jobs in the Australian economy lost. Most of those losses occurred from March 21st to April 4th. If you remember, the major shutdowns happened on March 24th. And so this goes to the point about the initial driver of this downturn being the health-related business closures. JobKeeper was announced on March 30th, and that probably explains why things have stabilised since April 4th. This is what the data look like. So the data are just by week, 14th of March through to April 18th. what the ABS tell us, or the way they've created the data, is in terms of an index. So that index was kind of like 100. So suppose we had 100 jobs on the 14th of March. You can see by the 4th of April, that's gone down to about 94. So we've lost about 6% of the jobs. And then in the next 2 weeks, by April 18th, that's gone down a bit more, 92.5. So we've lost 7.5% of jobs. What we also know is that so far the job losses have been concentrated among the young and the old. So this is the same sort of chart. The dark blue line at the top is the line I just showed you for everyone. And then we've got the brown line, which is under 20 years, and the grey line, which is 20 to 29 years. And that's telling us that basically for people under 20, about 18.5% of their jobs were lost between 14th of March and pretty much the 11th or the 18th of April. So basically 1 in 5 jobs held by people under 20 years gone. Then the grey line, which is people 20 to 29 years, that's about 13% of jobs have been lost over that period. In the next chart, I add people 70 years and over, and you can see they've lost about 14% of jobs. We don't know this yet. We won't have a handle on this until we see the labour force survey, but my guess is that a reasonable proportion of the 70 years and over may be older people who've withdrawn from the labour force because of fears of COVID. So the young, why would the young be experiencing such difficulties? Well, in fact, I'm not going to talk about this today, but in work that I was doing with my colleague Michael Coelho, even before this episode happened, we'd been charting the fact that young people had been having an increasingly difficult time in the labour market in the decade after the GFC. And that was being manifested in things like more long-term unemployment, more likely to transition to a full-time job through a part-time job. So we were already facing sort of a weak labour market for young people before this episode. And now we come along to a huge downturn, and the young are going to be undoubtedly the age group most adversely affected. Why is that? Well, it's because they're always the most adversely affected during downturns. That's because what happens in a downturn is that the rate of new job creation just stops or goes backwards. And there's net job losses. Now, the young are disproportionately in the group of people who are out there looking for jobs because they're making the transition from education to work. And so whenever there's a decline in the amount of new job creation, young people are always disproportionately adversely affected by that. This time, that's going to be exacerbated by JobKeeper, which for the next 6 months is really freezing employment as it was at the start of March or in mid-March. It's going to make it even harder for people who weren't already in employment to get into employment. Just to make this point about the fact that young people always do it harder during downturns. So this is a graph which shows what's called employment population rates by age from 2005 to 2015. And employment population rate is just the proportion of the respective age group. There's 2 lines there, 25 to 54, the brown line, and 15 to 24, the blue line. The employment population rate is the proportion of those groups who are in employment. So out of all the people aged 15 to 24, what proportion were employed? Now, what I've done here, because the point I want to illustrate is what happened after the GFC, I've kind of rebased both of these series at 2008. And I've sort of said, okay, suppose that we think of both those employment population rates being 0 in 2008, what happened to them after the GFC? And you can see that for people aged 15 to 24, there's almost an automatic drop of about 5 percentage points in the proportion who are employed. So as soon as the GFC comes along, the proportion of people aged 15 to 24 who are in employment decreases by 5%. There's a bit of a decrease for people 25 to 54, but you can see much less, about 1%. Then for 25 to 54-year-olds, it kind of goes along at the same level, about a 1% loss, out to 2015. But you can see for people 15 to 24, in fact, it gets even a bit worse after that time. So this is making the point that, look, when you have a downturn like the GFC, young people are always disproportionately adversely affected for the reason I said, which is that they're trying to get into the labour market, but there's no jobs being created. One other aside on this graph is that you might wonder, why is it I'm presenting data on the proportion of people in employment rather than a measure like unemployment? The reason I prefer to present data on the proportion of people employed is that we know that there's a lot of young people who are underemployed. And the problem with unemployment is that it doesn't take account of underemployment. It's the labour underutilisation, the extent to which people who want to work aren't getting into work. It's really a combination of unemployment and underemployment. And because underemployment is so high for young people, unemployment not such a good measure. So I prefer instead just to look at the proportion of people who are in employment. The next graph I just want to show you says something more specifically about young people, in particular 20 to 24-year-olds. I've created two series here in a similar way for people 20 to 24 not in full-time study who have a bachelor degree or higher as their highest educational qualification, and people who have below bachelor degree qualification. And what you can see is that for people who have a bachelor degree, when the GFC hit, they had a bit of a decrease in their employment population rate, but pretty quickly sort of recovers and bounces along, without much change in the succeeding years. Whereas for people who have below bachelor degree as their highest qualification, you can see that 3 or 4 years after the GFC, the proportion of that population group who are in employment has decreased by 11 percentage points. So there's 11 percentage points less people in that population group with lower level of education and skills who are in employment. And you can see that doesn't really reverse greatly in the period through to 2018, which is the most recent data we have. So not only do young people get more adversely affected, but young people with lower levels of educational qualification and skills get much, much worse affected than other groups. There's a couple of other factors which are going to matter this time as well. The young are working disproportionately in industries like accommodation, food services, retail and so on, which are going to be especially adversely affected. Also, you have to suspect that some older workers are likely to delay retirement to rebuild their superannuation balances. They're already in employment, so they have an incumbency advantage, and so that again is going to make it harder for young people. And so, what we're likely to see is a phenomenon called scarring. So scarring is the idea that, look, it's not just if you're entering the labour market during a time such as the present when there's a major downturn, it's not just bad for you during the downturn, but it's going to be bad for you, international evidence tells us, for potentially up to a decade afterwards. And that's for a couple of reasons. One is that one of the things that happens when you enter the labour market during a downturn is that you're more likely to become unemployed. And unemployment can cast, unfortunately, a long shadow forwards through the effect on skill atrophy, through stigma effects with employers, through affecting people's motivation. Being unemployed today is generally associated with a higher probability of being unemployed or out of work in the future. The other thing that happens during downturns is that the average quality of jobs that people getting jobs for the first time can obtain is reduced. So, I guess all employers are employing less, and so everyone kind of who's looking for a job has to shuffle down the job ladder in terms of the quality of job they can get. And so then what they're really doing in the years after they've entered the labour market is, if they can, try to move back up to the job ladder to where they might have been if they hadn't entered the labour market during a downturn. And what we know from international evidence is that people with higher levels of education, they can do that eventually. But people with low levels of education and skill, they're hardly able to move up the job ladder at all. They're much more likely to get stuck in the lower quality job that they were forced to take during a downturn. The other group who are going to be particularly adversely affected, I think, are the old. There's going to be, well, there has been already, I suspect, sort of withdrawal from the labour market by older people due to fear of contracting COVID, and also older people who are going to lose jobs. And for both those groups, poor prospects of re-employment. The group who find it hardest to get back into work once they become unemployed or out of employment are the older workforce. So particular problems for older workers as well. The other thing, just to say quickly, is that the data kind of show what we expect, that employment losses, for example, the green line is accommodation and food services, where we've seen decreases in employment of jobs of about 33%. So basically 1 in 3 jobs in accommodation and food services have been lost by 11th or 18th of April. The other one is arts and recreation services, which has been talked about a lot as well, where there's been over 25% of jobs lost. The next thing I want to do is just talk about what does economic recovery look like. What I've done here is something that's very sort of stylized. I've got a timeline on the horizontal axis. These are kind of time periods which maybe are, very roughly you can think of as there being about 6 months between each of these time periods. And on the vertical axis, I've got the change in employment expressed in negative numbers. And I guess what I'm showing here is that, look, in the first 6 months from March to August, September, I guess we don't know exactly, because it depends a lot on what happens with the health-related business reopenings. But the estimates are that there's probably going to be the Treasury estimates, if you back out from Treasurer Frydenberg's statement about what Treasury estimates the unemployment rate to be, is probably about 1.8 million jobs lost. Other estimates are around that the same. So I think probably the most reasonable estimates, based on kind of thinking what a plausible scenario is job losses of about 15%, or employment losses of about 15%. So that's what I've tried to show here, sort of. And then I've kind of showed the idea of a snapback recovery, which I guess for a little while was talked about. And I guess the thing to pay particular attention to in this graph is kind of the area below the line, because that's telling you, how, what's the sort of, the human cost, the economic cost in terms of jobs being lost. The bigger the area under the line is, the bigger the human and economic cost of this downturn is. Now, that would be snapback. I don't know anyone sort of who really thinks that snapback is going to happen. If you go back to what I talked about right at the start, firstly, it's not going to happen because we're not going to undo all the health restrictions in an instant. There has to be a reasonable probability, for example, of international travel restrictions persisting for quite a while, which will affect the aviation industry, international tourism, my industry, higher education. So just because of the health-related restrictions, there's not going to be a snapback. And the other reason there's not going to be a snapback is the longer this goes on, the more people experience income losses, the more businesses begin to lack confidence, and then you start to get those demand factors also causing this to go on for longer. Now, if the rate of recovery was to be sort of the rate of recovery of a normal recovery, this is what it might look like. Which is obviously a disastrous scenario in terms of the amount of time it takes employment to recover. I'm a bit more, I'm definitely more optimistic than the path being that path. I think that, again, coming back to the idea that this recession is different, we are going to see these mini surges of recovery when the government undoes some of the health restrictions. So once they allow people to start going to cafes and restaurants, once they remove restrictions which are maybe affecting retail and some other sectors, we're going to see some bounce back in employment. But it's not going to be back to the zero effect on employment. What it's going to be is a slightly more rapid over some periods of time, sort of, but still spreading out over a fairly long period of time. You might kind of think, well, at least that's a more optimistic scenario than if it was the brown line. What I'm going to show you next is what happened during the downturn in the 1990s. So our last major downturn, considered sort of, major, negative economic episode for Australia. In that episode, we lost about 350,000 jobs, but it actually took a lot longer amount of time, took a couple of years for that to happen. And then we bounced back sort of much more quickly. So if you compare sort of even kind of an optimistic scenario to what, which is this grey line, to what happened to the 1990s, you can see that there's kind of two things that distinguish it. One is we just haven't seen a decrease in the number of jobs that we've seen sort of in the last month or so, and are likely to see persist for at least sort of some greater period of time for a long time. We haven't ever seen that before. We haven't ever seen that before. So that's sort of one of the big elements of the cost here, that there's a huge number of people being affected who wouldn't usually be affected, and they're going to be affected for a decent amount of time. And then you see it sort of extending out for this period as well. Even if you're a bit more optimistic about the health openings and you thought, well, maybe we should take that up to there, you can still see that this is just a massive difference between, say, what happened in the 1990s and what's happening now. So the message from this is that we really do need to be thinking very seriously about policies for the recovery, because this is an episode that's affecting so many people. We're unlikely to snap back so quickly that it doesn't continue to affect a large number of people for long enough to make a difference to them. So then I guess that brings me to talking about policies, where I'm going to be very sort of schematic, because I want to kind of mention a few areas. The first area is macro policy. So the best thing that we can do to get people back to work is to get macro policy targeted employment growth. The best thing for improving the employment outlook is getting macro policy right. And so that means really worrying about things like whether company tax really is a policy that maximizes employment creation, or whether we can think of whether there are other stimulus type policies, other tax related type policies, for example, or spending policies, where we're going to get a lot more impact per dollar from the budget on employment. So getting macro policy is the number one thing we can do to assist economic recovery. But that isn't going to be enough, because even if we get macro policy as right as we can get it, I think the effects are still going to be so substantial and so sufficiently prolonged that if we're not operating on the margin of assisting other groups who are being adversely affected, then we're going to be doing permanent damage to them. And so then that comes back to thinking about the groups who are particularly affected, the young. And there's sort of almost a kind of a mathematics to thinking about this, in that if we accept the young are going to take longer to get into work because they're being most adversely affected, then what that means is essentially they have more time now between when they would have finished school and getting into employment than before this episode happened. And so there's three things that can happen. They can spend that extra time unemployed, they can spend it doing extra education, or we can try and have programs to maintain contact with the labour market. And obviously, it's the latter of those two that we should be thinking about seriously, but in a way that's not, for example, burdening young people with extra debt from having to take on more education or requiring them to do unpaid, type internships or work experience. The other thing I think is really important is to actually think, well, do we really need to accept that young people are the ones who've got to wait to get back into the labour market till things recover? There are things we could be thinking about to actively redistribute employment. So, for example, I think it's really, really important to avoid introducing policies to promote labour force participation by other groups at the moment, because every time we do that, we're going to be crowding out young people. Policies for older workers, there it's mainly about assistance to re-enter the labour market. The best way to do that, we know, is building around the circumstances of the individual. I think the other thing that's really important is the social safety net. So for the working age population, we know that their income and well-being depends on what happens when they're in work and what happens when they're out of work. So I think we need to relate the idea of a safety net to those two questions of what happens when in work and when out of work. And so I think we need to be thinking about minimum standards of income when in and out of work. I guess this isn't saying anything that I guess no one doesn't know already, but obviously we've got to think a lot about the job seeker. I mean, there's no way that our economy will have fully recovered by the time the raised level of job seeker finishes. And so just from a macroeconomic stimulus point of view, it would seem sensible to continue it for some time. But obviously, in the long run, we need now to engage with the idea of increasing its level. I think we got to think about, I think that this downturn's really exposed the position of casual employees. We've been, and I guess I've been completely guilty of this myself, engaged in sort of academic debates about, well, is casual employment going up by 2% or going down by 2%? The big thing we've missed is the fact that it is 30%. And so when you have a major episode like this, there's 30% of employees who are in a really precarious position. So I think we've got to think about that. And yeah, we've also got to think about, really sort of reorienting the services which are provided to job seekers. We had the new employment services review 2 years ago. It recommended very strongly a reorientation of the system towards job seekers with the highest barriers to getting into employment. It's one of those things, if not now, when you think of sort of implementing that policy. And now I'll try and escape. And screen sharing has stopped. Okay.
Thank you so much, Jeff. It's really terrific. Now I'm going to encourage those who are playing at home to ask some questions. So I've got some questions coming through now. I think what I might do, just because it's quite complicated to try to get people's faces up, but we'll, the first question is around the gender dimensions of employment. So what's happening in terms of the gender distribution of harms, and then what might happen in recovery?
Yeah, so two things about gender. So what we know from the data so far is that it's about females have lost about 8.5% of jobs. Males, I think it's about just over 6%. That's what people who are looking at the short term were forecasting, because females are disproportionately employed in accommodation and food services and retail and the arts and recreation sector. So there has been a slightly larger effect on females than males so far, and so yeah, that's, while it's not a huge difference at the moment, and while it's explained by the industry sector sort of, I think it's something that we really need to kind of have a closer look at when we get the labour force survey data and worry about ongoing. Like, the reason I look at labour force survey data is to look at things like, for example, if disproportionately large group of females who are losing their jobs were sole parents, for example, and that, then even though the male-female balance kind of doesn't look too different, you might get really worried about that female effect. I think the other issue which is really important and hopefully sort of won't be prolonged, although I'm not saying this is a reason for reopening schools or anything, but yeah, there's obviously sort of a lot of concern about females having a disproportionate share of, or doing disproportionate share of homeschooling sort of, and the negative effects that might be having on work and career. The ABS tell me that one of the products they've created for this episode is a survey of 1,000, random survey of 1,000 households. They've told me that the fourth survey, which is in the field at the moment, they're actually asking questions about the household distribution of homeschooling, and it's going to be really interesting to see that. I suspect we know what the answer is going to be, and for that reason, I think then about that we got to kind of think about if home working's going on, do we have the right settings for sort of accommodating homeschooling in terms of females at work, and females not being disadvantaged by the fact that it looks like they are doing sort of this disproportionate share of homeschooling.
So certainly interesting. I mean, my recollection of the data is that underemployment is particularly an issue for women and single women, and then we've also got this really vulnerable group of older women who really, particularly at the moment, face a risk of decline, of moving into poverty and homelessness, particularly if relationships break down. So the gender dimensions of this are quite interesting, and they do tend to get swamped by discussions of big infrastructure projects, for example, which, while women work in construction, certainly nowhere near in the numbers that men do. Look, a couple of other questions. There's another question on whether you've modelled the possible economic impacts of a second wave of COVID-19. So that's a sort of double dip, if you like, in having to close up again.
I haven't. I've got to admit, I find it hard enough sort of thinking about sort of the first wave kind of like, I guess we've really been sort of, like I said, the ABS have been absolutely brilliant sort of creating these new data products, but we have been sort of flying in the dark sort of quite a bit so far in terms of trying to understand what's happened. And so, like there's actually there's considerable disagreement amongst various groups, and that just in terms of what the effect will be of sort of a one wave kind of, like if you look, as I said, backing out, and this may be me not doing this properly, but my backing out of what I think Treasury are forecasting is about 1.8 million jobs lost. The Reserve Bank, they say 20%, which would be about 2.6 million. Grattan Institute, I guess have said 3.6 million sort of. So yeah, just because we sort of don't have such great data, there's a lot of uncertainty about what even the kind of short-term consequences of the episode we're in at the moment are. So it's kind of a period where if you want to, I feel like if you want to say anything kind of plausible and sensible, it's best not to look too far, sort of too far out in front of you.
So lots of other questions coming through. So one of the questions, and we're not going to try to do the zoom in, so I'm just going to repeat questions from people. So Stephen Torsey, if snapback's not realistic, what policies do you think will be most palatable for the government? Is austerity a real danger?
Well, I think austerity is, I mean, without saying that this is what the government's thinking of, but yeah, if a government was to be thinking of austerity, then that would be a real problem. Yeah, I guess I'm not sort of macroeconomist, but my colleagues in the department, of economics, who I really trust, tell me that look, it sounds like a lot of money that we're spending at the moment. In a lot of regards, it is. If you think about other ways we could have spent it if we didn't have COVID, but we do have COVID, so we got to deal with it. You know, their feeling is that we can afford more stimulus after this. That yeah, of course, there's a debt that's going to have to be repaid, but the big thing about debt is you can spread that repayment out over time. And of course, you know, it's paid by the young rather than the old and everything, but it can be spread over time. The big thing about an episode like this is that it's so concentrated, and so the human, the economic costs of, you know, this, you know, concentrated damage being done, you know, just really, I think, you know, far outweigh the cost of spreading out sort of the extra debt. So I suspect we're going to need ongoing, you know, stimulus, because I think there's not going to be snapback. There's going to be health restrictions maintained in place for some time to come. And that's, as that goes on, we're going to get these demand effects. So I can't see the need for stimulus sort of disappearing after 6 months. And as I said in talking about policy, I think where we need to really actively engage in that space now is what are the policies that are going to give us the biggest employment impact for each dollar we spend. And there, I think there are real questions about, you know, company tax being the best way.
So it's an interesting comment that another economist made to me the other day about, which I think which makes sense, that in the recovery phase, private sector organisations will be rebuilding their finances. They're not going to have an enormous appetite necessarily to bring on more people or to create new jobs, particularly the high quality jobs that we're interested in. So in his view, it's the public sector that's going to lead much of this, and that could be indirectly through the sort of infrastructure projects, but there's also potential around direct employment in the public sector, including through local government, which of course has enormous array of worthwhile projects that can be done, incredible spread, ability to engage with at the community level. And so I guess that makes me, there are a few other questions here about what sorts of, so if we just leave aside the macro level stimulus for a second, what sorts of program interventions, what sorts of programs like jobs guarantees, for example, should we be thinking about to try to best use the available resources to maximise opportunities?
Well, yeah, I guess, like I said, I kind of class it into the two categories. There's the things we're doing to sort of provide stimulus. And so, yeah, that could include, you know, like, well, obviously it involves public sector spending sort of, but as well as, you know, I guess you can get the money to households or businesses. You can fund public projects, or you can be employing sort of people. So I guess, you know, it's some mix of those that you want to be you know, thinking of. But as well, like I said, I guess where I've probably done, you know, most, you know, thinking in the past about programs is sort of with reference to the specific groups who might be sort of, you know, who might be most adversely affected. Because as I said, even if we run the best stimulus policy we can, you know, we're not going to sort of immediately or fully sort of undo the negative effects. So we got to accept that there are some groups who, if we just, you know, have a hands-off approach, are going to be, you know, adversely affected. So yeah, so when it comes to young people, I guess, yeah, my level of thinking about it is probably at a much more general level than yours and SVA's, Lisa. But yeah, I guess I come to this idea of, look, there's the education, skills development way of spending time, sort of, and there's the way of, you know, maintaining contact with the labour market. And so I think we you know, we need to be thinking about sort of ways in which sort of you know, young people can be engaged to you know, develop extra skills. Obviously, it's got to be stuff that's meaningful for them in types of their, you know, career, so they've got to be built into it. And then the work programs, or, you know, work experience programs and internship programs. Yeah, there, I think the things that I think is really important sort of is that it be, you know, paid and also substantive. So rather than sort of, work for the dole model, which is like, here's a project, go and work on this project, we have to be trying to engage with, things that young people who are, out of employment, their aspirations and what it is they want to do. So it's kind of, to steal your expression, I think, Lisa, it's got to be demand driven from young people rather than supply driven. I think that's like if you want to have overarching principles to think about sort of the way we should run, for example, programs for any type of program for getting people back into work, it's demand driven rather than supply driven. I think the same thing really applies to sort of employment assistance to try and help older workers get back into employment. We've had too many sort of top-down programs, not enough programs that actually are tailored to the circumstances of individual people trying to get into work, that relate to, well, what skills do they have? What are the job options in their area or other areas? What's the scope for actual mobility sort of, and that? What can be done to assist that? I think, I think we can, the history tells us that two things. One is, it's the programs sort of are going to be incredibly important sort of in the next couple of years, but we really risk spending a gigantic amount of money and just completely wasting it sort of, unless we kind of are willing to sort of start to build in some of the learnings from practice and I guess studies of practice sort of about how to make these programs work.
So just for the questioner that asked about job guarantees, actually our next webinar in 2 weeks will talk about the possibility of a job guarantee and what that might look like. And one of the interesting things about that is that it has not been fashionable to talk about creating work or the sort of very heavily subsidised wage programs for the last possibly 20 years, I would say. But the point that you make, Jeff, about this enormous disruption to young people's transition, and not just young people's transition, there's going to be a group of older workers and workers who are at the back of the queue who just are further back in the queue and whose only opportunity to work is going to be through some sort of heavily subsidised but paid, meaningful, worthwhile employment. And that's a radical shift, as you say, in thinking, but it's a shift that the sort of data that you've given us really highlights the need for. I suppose one other question, as just before we finish, and there are other questions here around apprenticeships and a whole bunch of things which are really great questions, and I apologise we can't get to them all. But I was interested in your reflections on the review that you were part of into employment services, and perhaps if you were thinking about some of the key recommendations that came out of that review that either are or aren't relevant for the current moment. I think you've touched on some of them, the need to tailor to individuals, to tailor to communities. Do you want to, I guess, finish about that, about thinking about employment services and what do the employment services look like for our time?
Well, yeah, I guess the really high level thing in that report obviously was the idea that the current system's not working for people with the highest barriers to employment. And is probably, therefore, and is too much targeted towards and spending too many resources on people who probably don't, need the, so much assistance to get into employment. And for that reason, the system needs to be kind of reoriented towards the job seekers who have the highest barriers to employment. And yeah, I guess the kind of idea of program that we had in mind was that you really need to sort of address the idea of job readiness, which for a lot of those job seekers with high barriers to employment could, it doesn't just mean knowing how to write a CV. It means often working with those people for a long period of time to deal with sort of major underlying barriers to obtaining employment. It means assisting to sort of develop vocational type skills that might be necessary for the type of work that the job seeker is really interested in doing. It means finding sort of work experience opportunities for the job seeker in the area they're interested in that match with the vocational training. And then it means really sort of, staying with the person in their period in job, in work experience, or in their initial period sort of in a job placement, to make sure that it works out for the job seeker and the employer. And yeah, I guess our idea was that you're only going to get sort of all those features if you're only going to get them working if you provide services that are really tailored to the job seeker and and tailored to the local community that the job seeker's in. And so you need a way of sort of funding providers, giving incentives to providers to be directing services in that way. I mean, one of the big things that sort of that we were really keen on was the idea that there needs to be much better linkages between the job active providers and the not-for-profits, welfare organisations. Like, all of the innovation, as far as I can tell, all of the exciting developments in getting people with high barriers to employment into work are happening sort of in the in the NGO sector. Things that, for example, SVA are doing. And so our idea, one of our ideas, for example, was that you've got to use that knowledge, that you've got to have ways in which that becomes part of the actual job active, or whatever it's called, system, sort of, that the job active providers sort of have as a major point of call to draw on the type of services that NGOs, welfare organisations, are providing, because those are the services that sort of meet this idea of being supply driven, tailored, matched to local communities.
Jeff, we're out of time. I've got a ton more questions in the mix and lots of ideas and engagement. As I mentioned, our next webinar in 2 weeks' time will be looking at the idea of a jobs guarantee. So we'll have a chance to sort of dig into that some more. But from the questions and engagement, and certainly from that presentation, Jeff, I think it's just been a fantastic kick-off to this webinar series, but incredibly stimulating for us in thinking about the dimensions of what we need to do in order to get an inclusive recovery. And your time and your expertise is enormously valued. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Lisa. Thanks, SVA. And if anyone's got questions that we didn't get to ask, I welcome you to email me, jib@unimelb.edu.au. So welcome. If there's anything you'd like to follow up on with me.
So this recording, and I think your slides as well, will be made available to people afterwards. So they'll be there, and we'd be very happy to continue the conversation, also to get any suggestions for future topics. Thank you so much. Now I meant to put up this other slide, which I'll try to do as per my instructions. And look, have a safe evening, and look forward to talk to you next time. Bye.
Thanks.